Welcome back. At least I hope this is back, because this is one of the final, or possibly the final video in this particular series. In this video, I want to focus on proofreading. So instead of a presentation with bullet points coming in where I explain things to you, what I'm going to do is just look at a page, literally one page cut out of each of 4 different laboratory reports that were submitted by students in my class last semester. So we're going to take a look at 4 actual cases of student writing and take a look and see where are there problems or things that could be fixed or things that could be done better. So the idea is, when you are going to be writing something, there are 3 stages. The first stage is planning. You need to figure out what you're going to write. The second stage is actually writing it. And then the third stage is checking to ensure that it's correct. And that could mean many, and does mean many different things. But basically it falls under the category of proofreading. Proofreading is where you check your work to make sure that everything is correct. So that your formatting is correct, that your word choice is correct, that you've included the correct information, and so on. It's checking to make sure it's all correct. So whenever you write something, even if you're writing an email to your mom, you should proofread it before you click the send button. And anything first class, you definitely should proofread it again, fix it some more, sleep, and then proofread it yet again and fix it some more before you actually turn it in. Trying to write your assignment the night before it's due and submitting it pretty much guarantees there will be lots of errors in your assignment. Do things a little bit early. Professors generally do not mind if you turn things in early. And in fact, if they do, that's still not a big deal. Finish it early and then just relax. Just don't forget to submit it at the correct time. So in this video, let's do some proofreading. Okay, so let's take a look at some student writing. The examples that we'll be looking at today are from the semester prior to making these videos. So this is actual student writing. Don't worry too much yet, at least, about the exact words. I'm not going to be able to point out every single error or problem with word choice and grammar and so on. But let's take a look at this from the perspective of proofreading. So maybe imagine this is your report or a page in your report. Or maybe a friend has asked you to proofread their report for them. What I'd like you to do is actually just take a look at this image, take a look at this writing, and tell me, or at least tell yourself, what's wrong? What needs to be fixed? As a proofreader, as you look at this, what do you see? And you're like, oh, there's probably a mistake. There's probably a problem. Now, if you're thinking, well, how can I tell what the problems are? The writing's too small. I'm watching a video and it's too blurry. I can't read the words. Then actually, you're missing a number of important points of proofreading. Proofreading is much, much more than looking for grammar problems or for punctuation problems. You have to look at everything, including the formatting. So when I look at this, literally before I start looking at individual words, the first thing I noticed in the particular case of this page was it looks like we have full justification, straight left edge, straight right edge in this paragraph, but left justification, a jagged right edge and a straight left edge, left justification down here. So it appears that there's an inconsistency in terms of justification. Now, as I've said in the prior videos, in general, you should be using left justification. But if you want to be using full and your professor's okay with that, then of course that's fine. But whether you're using full or left, in either case, you must be consistent. One of the most important aspects of proofreading is to make sure that the writing and the presentation is consistent. So it is very wrong to have one paragraph fully justified and one paragraph not. That's considered more wrong than doing it one way consistently or the other way consistently. So how would you go about fixing this? Well, if you're in your word processor, normally you would just click anywhere inside the paragraph. So in this case, I've clicked inside the word acceleration, but anywhere in the paragraph. And there's usually buttons that are available for setting your justification. It depends on your word processor. It may depend on your operating system. There might be settings somewhere in one of the menus for this, but somewhere there will be a way of setting justification, sometimes called alignment. So if you look here, you can see that the full justification button is pressed. And indeed, it looks like it's fully justified. All we have to do is click on the left justification button, and voila, it's now corrected. Now, of course, if this paragraph had full justification, then what about on the next page, and the page after that, and the page after that? This is a problem that for some reason occurred. So you really need to check this paper carefully to make sure everything is justified in the same way. Preferably, that would be left justification. Another way you can fix this is you can select everything. So I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut to select everything in the document. And then you can go and set left justification. This is good because this will fix all of the paragraphs simultaneously. But the bad thing is, as you may have noticed, the equations that were centered, the headings that were centered, they get moved to the left as well. And you do have to then go back to each one and set it, in this case, center justification. Same thing for the method. And then fix those. So you can either select all or you can do them one by one, but you need to make sure that all of your paragraphs are justified the same way, preferably with left justification. Okay, so we fixed that problem. As proofreaders, what do you see is additionally a problem here? Well, my answer is I'm looking at this paragraph and the font looks very large compared to the font down here. Or maybe that's small compared to that one. And as I look at it, I have this impression that the letters are actually slightly different shapes. So rather than a font size problem, I think a different font may be being used. So click anywhere in one of the paragraphs. So here I'm clicking on the word gravitational in this paragraph and check the font. Here, Century font is being used. Now, as I said earlier, Times New Roman is your safest font and probably what you should always be using, but Century is also acceptable. So that's not necessarily wrong, it's just not preferred. It's not wrong though. Now let's click anywhere down in this paragraph and check again, Times New Roman. So Century is being used at the top and Times New Roman at the bottom. As I mentioned earlier, consistency is very important. This is inconsistent, and this would make someone who's reading it think that the writer is very careless, that they've just cut and pasted their report together, that they don't pay attention to details. And in the case of writing a laboratory report, the last thing you want to do is give the impression to your professor that you are not paying attention, that you are not being careful. So this is really bad because even before your professor starts reading the report, they see the justification inconsistencies, they see the inconsistencies in the fonts, and they're thinking, boy, this student isn't doing anything right. And so they have a very negative view of you before they even start grading. So tactically, that's a very unwise thing to do. So when you proofread, check for consistency, make sure you're following the correct approaches. So in this case, this is Times New Roman, which is what I recommend people use. So we could go and just select the parts that are in the other font and change it, but oh, wait, that's also in Century too, isn't it? It's probably better to just go to your edit menu and select all, or use a keyboard shortcut and select all, then go to your fonts and select whatever you want. Now, if up near the top the font doesn't appear that you're looking for, then what I recommend is move your cursor down into the font list and then type a letter on your keyboard. So Times New Roman starts with T. So either hit T or U is the next letter in the alphabet. So I'm going to hit U on my keyboard. And it will then jump to the names of the fonts that start with U. In this case, there aren't any, so it jumps to V. But it puts me right below the T's. And that displays them very nicely for me. And I can say, ah, there's Times New Roman. I do not have to go into the submenu in most word processors. I can just click here. And since I had selected all, everything is now changed to Times New Roman. Okay, so we found and fixed the justification inconsistency, and now we found and fixed the font inconsistency. Now again, looking at it, do you see any problems without actually reading any words? Just looking at it, do you see any problems? Well, I do see one more, and this one, it's not as obvious, but it's obvious enough that any proofreading should catch it. I'm looking at the indent of the first line of this paragraph. That looks awfully short. It's a very small indent, closer to what you'd see in Japanese writing. But in English writing, we always indent by a ½ inch, or 1.27 centimeters. If I look up here, that looks about the same as down here. Maybe it's not exact, but it looks pretty close. So that again looks a little bit short. And then here, there's no indent. Now that might be intentional, because it might be that this is part of this paragraph, that this whole thing is a paragraph. So that might be okay. But these look a little bit short. So let's, for fun, let's just click down here at the word in. Okay, I'm going to move the cursor with the arrow keys to be in front of the eye. And what I want to find out is, how did the students create the indents? Because there's multiple ways you could do it. So I'm going to hit the left arrow on the keyboard. Okay, we can see there's a space there. I'm going to do it again. That's 2 spaces. I'm going to do it again. That's 3 spaces. Okay, so this student typed 3 spaces and then started typing their paragraph. That's too little in the case of English writing. Just for a quick check for consistency, I'm going to do the same thing up here. I'm going to move up to where it says when. I'm going to hit the left arrow once, and nothing happens. I'm clicking, nothing's happening. What does this mean? This means inconsistency. So this student, for some paragraphs, hit the space bar on their keyboard 3 times, and other times they use the word processor's paragraph formatting features. Let me pull up the paragraph formatting for you and show that to you. So if you go to format paragraphs, or I used a keyboard shortcut to bring this up, you can see that this deals with formatting of paragraphs. There's lots of things you can set. Right now we're looking at indentation specifically for the first line. And we can see that the student set it for 1.5 characters, not 1.5 centimeters, but 1.5 characters, which is wrong. You should not do it that way. It should be done in centimeters, and it should be 1.27. Okay, I'm going to cancel this and then move the cursor down into this paragraph and pull up the paragraph formatting. And we can see that there is no special indents. They did not set a first line indent. There was none. So again, we can see they're doing things inconsistently. This will make it much harder for people to do revisions later. So you really want to be consistent. This is one that maybe the reader won't notice as an inconsistency because these look about the same. But it is an inconsistency and it'll be harder to fix. So for this one to fix it, we would have to do something like just delete the 3 spaces and then put in a tab. I hit the tab key once. And here, what I think I'll do is I'll bring up that paragraph formatting and I'll just select the first line indent and I'm going to set it to 0. Okay, so that moved back over and then I'm going to hit a tab to move that in. Okay, so 1 tab. This is what I recommended in my prior video, that you should just use 1 tab. And the reason is because most word processors by default have the tab set at 1.27 centimeters. However, this student, for some reason, possibly by accident, changed the tabs. This little right-handed arrow symbol shows where the tab mark is. And this ruler is marked out in centimeters. So we're actually too far in. So, or maybe we're actually too far back for something, but we definitely have a misalignment going on here. So let's grab that tab. Just going to grab it with the cursor. I'm clicking once and holding, and let's just move that back to about 1.25 centimeters. Okay, and it's been corrected. But it's only been corrected for this paragraph. It didn't do this one. So let's undo that fix. I'm going to select all. And now let's grab the tab so it'll affect everything. All paragraphs, move that to 1.25, and now they've all been fixed. Now, technically this is still wrong. It's 1.25 rather than 1.27 centimeters, but it's close enough that probably no one will notice the error. So those are 3 problems we've had, and notice we have not had to look at a single word. We have not read anything. All we did was look at the paper and saw, Oh, the justification is inconsistent. Oh, the font is inconsistent. Oh, the paragraphs are misindented. These are things that need to be fixed during proofreading, even before you start looking at the individual words and fixing problems with singular or plural, fixing problems with punctuation, or fixing grammar or other word choice errors and confusing sentences and so on. Okay, that's all I wanted to say for this particular example, but don't worry, I have 3 more examples. So let's take a look at another student's submission. Okay, so if we take a look at this one, what do we see? This is, again, a sample of student writing from the prior semester. So take a look at that, take a moment, and do you see any problems? Hopefully, that's all the time you need to notice because we just pointed it out. Again, we have the same problem here. Here we have full justification, yet down here we have left justification. This is inconsistent. Inconsistency is considered very bad in scientific writing. So we need to make it more consistent, and ideally, I'm going to select all, and then I'm going to select left justification, and then this method heading got moved, so I'm going to move that back to centered. There we go. Okay, and now we have the justification fixed. Some of you might be noticing, oh, the word method, that heading is not in bold. It depends on your class and where you're submitting your work. I do generally recommend that you put the headings in bold, but that will vary a lot. So check with your professor if you're doing this for a class to see what they like. Okay, let's actually start looking at some of the words. I'm not going to, in this video, take the time to read all the sentences and point out all the problems, but I just want to point out the type of thing that you might want to be looking for carefully when you're proofreading. Okay, so let's go down, okay, blah, 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 blah. Let's start here. So the student has written something, and then they said, therefore, the gravitational acceleration is given by, and blah, blah, blah. Therefore, 2 words. But the word therefore is 1 word. The word therefore is 1 word. Now notice, a spell checker will not find these incorrect words because these are words. The word there is a word. The word for is a word. So your spell checker will not check this. When you're proofreading, you need to notice these kinds of problems and correct them to the correct words. So when somebody reads a report that has this type of error in it, again, the message it gives to the reader is, the writer is not careful. The writer is careless. The writer does not check their work. So it's very, very important that you not rely on spell checkers to make sure you have the correct words. You need to check the words yourself, every single word. Let's go down a little bit and look at something else here. Okay, so the materials in this experiment included an H-type stand, a clamp holder, a clamp, blah, 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 blah. Okay, let's look at this paragraph here. Okay, so the student then wrote, at first, probably they needed a the there, at first the clump had to be attached to the H-type stands. Clump? A clump is a bunch of things stuck together. Very, very different than a clamp, which is something that grabs onto or holds things. But a clump is an English word. So the students correctly use the word clamp in one place, but I assume accidentally use the word clump in another. But that's wrong. This will confuse your reader, and even if it does not confuse the reader will be thinking, oh, this student did not proofread their paper, and thus have a negative view of the author. And if it's a professor who's giving you a grade, you do not want them to have a negative view of you. So you need to check every single word to make sure it's correct. In this particular paper, I was a little amused by one more of these types of word errors because I'm a bit of a fan of science fiction, fantasy type things. And of course, that means I like Harry Potter. As you know, Harry Potter is a witch. Then measure the amount of time which it takes to complete. That's the wrong which. The students presumably meant W-H-I-C-H. Okay, pronounced the same way, but very different. The other spelling is a person who has magical abilities. This one is a very different word. So again, these word errors where it sounds right or it sounds close, it's not good enough. When you proofread, you must check every single word. Make certain that every word is the word you intended to use. Make sure it's spelled correctly. And if it's a verb, make sure it's in the correct tense. If it's a noun, make sure that it's singular or plural, whatever is correct for your situation. But you need to check every word individually. Some people think, oh, if I use a spell checker, that's all I need. And the answer is no, that's not all you need. Which, as in like Harry Potter, was a word. There and for are words. Clump is a word. But all of these things need to be fixed before you submit your reports. Okay, let's take a look at a third report. Okay, so what do you see when you look at this report or these lines from this report? Well, the first thing I notice, because I always, before I look at the words, I look at the shape, I look at the basic formatting, is again we have something really weird going on. So we have these lines, look at the size of the lettering, and then suddenly, right about here, it gets small. The shape of the letters looks pretty similar, but the size doesn't. So let's click over here. We're Times New Roman font, 12 points, that's good. Times New Roman is what I recommend, and 12 points is what you should pretty much always use when you're writing in almost anything in English. But let's click over here, like, you know, the trial. Let's click on the word trial. And it's still Times New Roman, that's good, but the font size is 11. So it looks like the is kind of small. Yep, that's still 11. And as we go into the word although, it jumps to 12. So the student, I have no idea how or why, but in the middle of a sentence, changed the font size. So I'm going to keep saying these things, but I want to make sure you understand it. When a professor sees something like this, the first thought is, wow, that is careless. And you don't give an A to students that are really, really careless. So you're really hurting yourself when you make little mistakes like this. As far as why did it suddenly become an 11-point font, I don't know, but actually this looks like it's bigger again, doesn't it? Let's click over here and see. Yeah, it's back to 12. So this sentence in the middle suddenly goes to 11. I don't know why. If I was to guess, I would speculate that the student copied and pasted it from another document, and they did not adjust the formatting after doing that. But it's really strange because it's right in the middle of a sentence, but this is what was submitted. Okay, so since pretty much everything should be in a 12-point font, why don't we just select everything? So I'm using my keyboard shortcut to select all. You could, of course, as I mentioned before, go to your edit menu and select all. So everything's selected, and then we'll go up to the font size box, and usually 12 point is listed. If the size you want is not there for some reason, like if for some reason you wanted a 19 font size, you normally would not want this, but you can just click in the box, type the number, and hit return. But if there's a drop-down menu, that's usually the easiest. So we'll set everything to 12. Okay, so now, as you can see, the size has been corrected. And because we selected all first, everything in the documents has now been corrected with regard to that error. So one of the problems here was the font. Okay, so what else is a problem? Let's take a look at some of the actual wording. Again, there's material before this. This is towards the end of the introduction, and the student is about to tell us what their hypothesis is for the experiment. And they wrote, my hypothesis is that although the trial is done with blah, blah, blah. Okay, my. Remember, no I, no we, no you, no our, none of these words. My is one of those words. So this needs to be reworded. So instead of my hypothesis is that, it should be something like, it was hypothesized that. Okay, so it was hypothesized that. Okay, so move it to the passive voice. So any place you see an I, a we, a my, an our, a you, look and see if would a passive voice type thing fix it. So it was hypothesized that, although the trial is done, blah, blah, blah. Much better from a scientific writing perspective. Okay, what other things do I notice here? Normally, when I'm reading, I would actually be reading from the beginning, reading word for word, but for this video, I just want to focus in on a few particular items. Let's take a look at this next sentence here. And each value of gravitational acceleration that was calculated in this experiment, whatever it is they're saying, and each value. You might not know it if you weren't taught this before, but there's a very odd rule for English, which is that in formal writing, and ideally in all speaking and writing, we never start a sentence with the word and, or but. The three primary conjunctions are never used as the first word of a sentence. So we need to do something to get rid of this. It's not grammatically incorrect, but when people see this in writing, they think, this person doesn't really know English very well. So no and, or but as the first word of a sentence. Now there's two primary ways of fixing this kind of an error. One is just to use a different word that has the same meaning. So instead of and, you can often use additionally. So additionally, each value of gravitational acceleration. That might be one approach. Another approach might be sometimes to just delete the word entirely. And in fact, in this case, that's what we can do here. So let's just delete the word. Okay. Each value of gravitational acceleration will be calculated with the following equation. Okay, so sometimes you can just delete it. It's really not needed. But if the word is needed, usually you can replace it with something else. So for and, additionally is an obvious choice. If you're trying to get rid of the word or the word but, maybe however, or although, or on the other hand. There's a number of options that are available. So think about when you see and, or but starting a sentence, you need to get rid of it. And if you need the meaning, just pick a different word or term that does that for you. Okay, that's what I want to show you in this report, but don't worry, we have another one that I want to show you. Okay, in this example, again, what do I see or what do you see when you first look at it? There might not be any obvious problem before you start looking at the words, but there are a few little details that might be done differently in sort of the big picture. So one thing I'm looking at is we have the word introduction. So it's a section heading saying it's the introduction. And if we scroll down a little bit, then there's the method section. Now, this student chose to use a larger font. Let me just click on that for a minute, an 18-point font for their headings, while using a 12-point font for the main text. That's not necessarily wrong, but traditionally you'd use the 12-point fonts for all of your headings. You would just make them in bold or italics, or maybe both, depending on what your professor likes or what the publication where you're trying to publish normally does. But there's another issue, and that is the beginning of a document is always the introduction. And because the beginning is always the introduction, the custom has developed in English writing that you do not use a heading for the introduction. You literally just delete it. You skip it. So since everybody knows the first thing is the introduction, you do not need the heading for introduction. Many people would not consider it wrong to include, but traditionally it would not be there. As I was mentioning, the other headings, usually you'd want them to be in the same font and font size as the rest of the document, and you'd probably want them centered, and you'd probably want them in bold. But again, if you've been given instructions on how to format your documents, obviously follow those instructions. But when you do not have instructions, same font size, centered, bold would probably be the best choice for your section headings. Okay, let's start reading it. This, as you know, is the introduction. Okay, it's not a middle page, it's actually the very beginning of the report. Let's just read the first sentence. In the case of using a vertical spring to measure gravitational acceleration, gravity acting on the weight is equal to the spring restoring force. My response to that sentence is, huh? What on earth is this student writing about? Remember, when you write a laboratory report or a scientific article or essay, you are writing for somebody who does not know what you're talking about. So how did they start? In the case of using a vertical spring, What's a vertical spring? I don't know, okay? To measure gravitational acceleration. So now I'm guessing maybe a vertical spring is a spring that's up-down instead of sideways. So a spring oriented vertically to measure gravitational acceleration. But wait a minute, why on earth or how would you use a spring to measure gravitational acceleration? I have no idea. Well, that means I lack the backgrounds, but the student, the writer, is supposed to give the backgrounds. So what's going on here? They're assuming way too much. The very first sentence assumes the reader understands what they mean by vertical spring. It assumes that they know, that the reader knows that you could measure gravitational acceleration with a vertical spring. And it then goes on to say gravity acting on the weight. The weight. Which weight? What weight is this? Is this a weight hanging from the spring? Is it the weight of the spring? It's not clear. The student is assuming the reader is familiar with the research and they already know all of this stuff. But they don't. They often will not know. Now, your professor, if it's a laboratory report, probably will know. But remember that when you write a laboratory report, you are writing for the naive reader. You're writing for someone who has never taken the class, who has never seen the experiment, who is in a different field, and thus will not know the background. So when I started to read this report, this was submitted in one of my classes, the very first thought I had when I finished the first sentence was, okay, well, my first thought, I guess, was, well, this is not going to be an A, because the student simply made huge assumptions about the background knowledge of the reader. You should not do that. There should be at least a paragraph telling me what is gravitational acceleration. There should be another paragraph talking about how a spring can be used to measure gravitational acceleration. And during that, it might introduce what the weight is, but if not, then we need more information before we even talk about the weight, because otherwise the reader doesn't know what weight you're referring to. So remember, when you're writing a report, it's for the naive reader, someone who does not know what you did, who does not know why you did it. And you need to explain the background in the introduction. So here the entire introduction was one paragraph, so obviously too short. There should be a paragraph on gravitational acceleration. There should be a paragraph on using springs to measure it. There should probably be, I see that we have some symbols coming up leading to some maybe equations. So there should probably be, oh yeah, there's an equation down here. So we should have a paragraph on the equations that are used. So this needs major expansion. In fact, it should be deleted and completely rewritten in a logical order involving at least 3 paragraphs. Probably, no, it have to be more than that, because you then have a paragraph on what the hypothesis of this particular research was. So there'd probably be at least 4 paragraphs. So this needs a lot of work, but the key problem is assuming your reader knows more than they do. So always be careful when you're writing to make sure you write for the naive reader. So during this video, we've looked at some examples of student writing and some problems that should be noticed during proofreading. So we've seen problems with fonts being the wrong fonts or inconsistent fonts, the wrong size or inconsistent sizes, justification that was either incorrect or inconsistent, and as well as a few other little things, the use of headings, where you put them, where you don't, how you format them, not starting sentences with and, or but, and of course checking individual words to make sure they're the correct words. Now this is just a little video on proofreading. Proofreading is much, much more than I can do in a little video. So what else do you look for? Well, after you've checked all the formatting and it seems to be correct, you'll want to check every word. I mean, literally, you go through and you read every word, make sure they're the correct words, check the sentences to make sure they're grammatically correct and that the punctuation is correct, and check to make sure the paragraphs are in a logical order, the information is being presented, and of course make sure that you're presenting the right information and that you're presenting the right information in the right places. So for example, backgrounds on the method would appear in the introduction possibly. So about how would you use a vertical spring to measure gravitational acceleration? Well, the general approach might be talked about in the introduction. But the detailed approach would not appear in the introduction. It would appear in the materials and methods section. So make sure the correct information is in the correct place. What else would you look for? Watch your verbs, make sure your tenses are correct. Of course, your nouns, singular and plural, make sure that it's whatever is correct for the situation you're in. Also, make sure your article usage, a, an, and the, is correct. And if you're Japanese and saying, but in English, that's so hard, well, what should you do? My recommendation is, when you're writing your introduction or preparing to write your introduction, you're hopefully reading other people's research. Don't read other Japanese people's research. Read stuff written by people from the UK or the United States or some other place where English is the primary language, and look and see, what are they using? How are they using the articles a, an, and the? What terminology are they using? Learn the terminology, and then you can improve your writing by modeling it on native speakers. That's one way of doing it, which I think is probably the most effective. You can also learn all of the rules and be very, very careful as you check to make sure you're following all of the rules. Don't forget to check the punctuation. We didn't do that at all in this video, but you need to make sure you're using the correct punctuation in the correct places, because punctuation carries meaning. It conveys meaning. It's not just something that's there to be pretty. So make sure you understand punctuation, and when you proofread, you check it. Now, if it sounds like, boy, proofreading's going to take a long time, the answer is yes. If you want to write well, you will actually spend the most time planning your writing. You'll spend a little bit of time writing and a moderate amount of time proofreading, revising, and fixing. So you literally, if you have your plan of what you're going to write and you write that all out in your word processor, if that took you, let's say, 3 hours, your proofreading should probably take 6. You literally should be spending more time proofreading than you spend writing, because you need to check everything, and you need to check it carefully. And after you've checked it on screen, and it seems to be perfect, make a printout. Because odds are, when you look at a hard copy, a printed copy, you will find more problems than you could find on screen. So proofread, print, and proofread again. Hope this helps your writing. Do this for your Japanese as well. Do this for English, do this for all languages, do it for everything. So I hope these videos have helped you in improving your writing. I hope you'll remember what's being taught here and make good use of it. And good luck in the rest of your lives, which will involve a lot of writing.